We've talked about non-use responsible use. We've talked about problem use. We've talked about abuse, and we've talked about dependence. Another term that is frequently used in relation to dependence, or in a similar way that we use the term dependence, is addiction. And so I want to take a couple minutes and share with you what is really the most current understanding that we have about what is addiction and why it occurs. I want to begin with a quote from the former director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and his name is Alan Leshner. And from all the research that they were doing at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, what Leshner was able to do is come up with, I think, what is a pretty succinct definition of drug addiction. Drug addiction is a brain disease that develops over time as a result of the initially voluntary behavior of using drugs. Now, there's some very interesting aspects of this definition. First and foremost, what's being emphasized is that addiction is definitely related to structure and functional changes that take place in the brain of some individuals, not everyone, that results in compulsive use of drugs or alcohol. And the definition also emphasizes the point that really no one intentionally wants to develop an addiction to drugs. The initial use of drugs is not because someone is addicted to drugs. The initial use and the reason why most people start using drugs is it's socially acceptable. They want to fit in with their peers. Taking psychoactive drugs makes you feel good. But people don't start out with, hey, I think I'd like to become a drug addict. So let's look at a little bit about how this changes. And I want to talk a little bit about drug addiction and the role of the brain, and why Leshner has characterized drug addiction as a brain disorder or brain disease. So what typically happens in some individuals is continuous use of drugs and alcohol causes some structural and functional changes in the individual's brain. Now, how do we know this is occurring? Well, today we have a technique called MRI, where you can actually look in individuals' brains while they're still using it. You know, we don't have to wait till they're not using it and we can autopsy their brain. We can actually look at the brain in very detailed ways using magnetic resonance imaging. And what this technique has identified is that the structural and functional changes that take place related to addiction occur in a particular area of the brain. And this area of the brain is called the reward system, or the reward pathway in the brain. And there are three areas in the brain that make up this reward pathway. One is the ventral tegmental area, and you can see that in the where that's located in the picture on your slide. The second area is the nucleus accumbens, and the third area is the prefrontal cortex. And these areas make up the what is called the brain reward pathway. Now, it's important that we have this brain reward pathway because it was necessary and essential, literally, for the human organism to exist and sustain life. And there are some very natural things that stimulate the reward pathway. Food, for example, is something that will stimulate the reward pathway and give and has the potential to give a a sense of pleasure and comfort and feeling good. Having close relationships and having positive feelings about interacting with other people is something that can naturally trigger the reward pathway in the brain. What the brain research using MRI has helped identify is that not only do we have these natural things that stimulate the reward pathway, every psychoactive drug that we take, and that includes alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, any of those psychoactive drugs that have their primary effect in the brain have the potential to stimulate this brain reward pathway. Now, different drugs may have different points on the pathway where they stimulate the reward response, but they act just like normal experiences that would give us a sensation of reward and accomplishment and a sense of self-satisfaction. So in this dependent stage of drug and alcohol use, what happens is, because of the continued use of drugs and alcohol, there are some structural and functional changes that take place in the brain. The role of the ventral tegmental area is to release dopamine. And dopamine is a very, very powerful neurotransmitter. And when that neurotransmitter reaches the nucleus accumbens, that's what stimulates this sensation of pleasure. And that gets interpreted then, this sensation of pleasure gets interpreted by your prefrontal cortex, and your brain literally is saying, you know, I like this. I like things that stimulate the release of dopamine. And every time we use drugs or alcohol, the dopamine is released. It goes to the nucleus accumbens and we get this sensation of pleasure. Well, what happens is, with continued abuse of drug and alcohol, is that dopamine only gets released as a result of taking the drug. Things that normally would have triggered the dopamine release and allow us to experience reward and pleasure in our life are no longer effective. So interactions with family, other kinds of positive experiences don't result in this dopamine release and sense of pleasure. What that means is, to get a sense of pleasure and reward, an individual needs to continue to take their drug. So the drug replaces the things in life that would normally give pleasure. So basically the essence of addiction is now life revolves around the drug. The individual has uncontrollable compulsive drug craving, seeking, and use, and that's because in order to experience pleasure and reward in their life, they need to take the drug. And they continue to take the drug even in the face of negative health and social consequences. So with this understanding about addiction, some of the myths and misconceptions of addiction, you know, we can put aside. Drug dependence and addiction is not based on weak moral will. It's not based on intemperate behavior, as we used to say in the past, or it's not based on bad people abuse drugs. Our understanding of addiction now is much more complete in that we understand that the brain plays a very important role. Now, you might ask, why does this happen? Well, research is suggesting that about 60% of the potential or risk for these brain changes that take place and the risk for addiction are related to genetics. So it's very, very important that we know our family history in relation to drug and alcohol use and abuse. Much like we know our family history in relation to cancer and cardiovascular disease. If cancer and cardiovascular disease runs in our family, I think it's pretty well accepted by people that, and pretty well understood by people that as individuals then we would be at increased risk for those diseases. The same thing is true with addiction. If there's a family history of addiction, then it's important to know that, understand that, and then pay attention for some of the warning signs that may be indicating that drugs and alcohol are starting to cause significant problems in our life. So again, I want to emphasize that this discussion about drug and alcohol use and drug and alcohol dependence really was not intended to try and label you in any one particular pattern of use. Again, I think it's very appropriate at this point in time, after experiencing a DUI, to think about your pattern of drug use, your pattern of alcohol use. What role is it playing in your life? Are you exhibiting any of these characteristics of abuse and dependence? And if so, like other chronic diseases, there are programs and services out there that offer treatment that can be very helpful. If you feel the need that there might be something going on in your life in relation to drugs and alcohol that you're not comfortable with and it is causing problems, you can identify those local resources that you have that provide drug and alcohol treatment services.